Welcome to Silk 201, to the first module. We're going to discuss linguistics here. These are ideas that I want you to absolutely keep in mind during the whole of the semester, and certainly make reference to them and be aware of them as you do your discussions and as you do your flips. Let's start with the notions of competence and performance. Essentially, competence is what's in your brain. In other words, what you know about your language. That means your lexicon, the words, your knowledge of the phonology and the phonetics of the language, your knowledge of the grammar. Performance is what actually comes out of your mouth. What it is what you say. Now, the thing is that performance can be very faulty. There are all kinds of performance errors. There's mispronunciations of words. There's using the wrong word. There's occasionally misconjugating a verb or using an incorrect gender for languages that mark gender. All of these things happen for a variety of reasons. Because you're distracted, because you're tired, because you've had a couple of glasses of wine, etc. So what linguists do is to try to get at competence, but competence is not always very clear. So we have to look at the performance in order to determine what the competence is. There's different ways of doing that. Corpus linguists, for example, use a body of data to see the patterns that emerge. And generative linguists will ask for intuitions. So a generative linguist will ask a native speaker if a sentence is grammatical or not. One problem with asking for intuitions is that native speaker judgments are often influenced by the notion of prescriptive grammar. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Linguists have to learn how to get around that. So we look at performance in order to try to get to the competence. If you want to look at it another way, performance is imperfect, but competence is perfect. Competence is the ideal, and we're trying to reach it while looking at something that is not ideal. Earlier, I used the word grammatical. What does that mean exactly? Well, essentially, grammatical in linguistic terms means that a sentence, word, or sound follows the rules of the language. Now, we have to be careful when we talk about rules. We mean the rules that are inherent in the language, not the ones that you find in grammar books. So, for example, if we look at these first two sentences, I walked the dog, or the dog walked I, well, we know that that second sentence is just not a good sentence of English because it doesn't follow the rules. We know that English has subject, verb, object, word order. So the second pronoun would be understood as the object. The form of the pronoun should be me. If it's the subject, then it's in the wrong place. Now, yes, it's true that you'll find sentences of the structure, the dog walked I, in poetry or in songs. But that's a very particular use that forces you to think about the sentence. In ordinary speech, that word order is incorrect. If we look at the next two sentences, I wonder what that's for, that's a perfectly good sentence of English. Now, prescriptive rules, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, would say that no, you have to say, I wonder for what that is, because you're not supposed to end a sentence with a preposition. But we know we all do that all the time. And no one would bite an eye at, I wonder what that's for. In fact, we might look askance at someone who says, I wonder for what that is, even though it fits the prescriptive rule. It just sounds wrong. So grammatical means what is natural, what sounds correct to a native speaker of the language. Another example is, for instance, we plan to boldly go where no one has gone before. That breaks the prescriptive grammar rules because the adverb boldly goes between to and the verb. In grammar books, you read that in English you can't split an infinitive. However, it doesn't sound quite correct. And it certainly doesn't have the same oomph to say that we plan to go boldly where no one has gone before, or we plan boldly to go where no one has gone before. So again, we have to consider what sounds natural, what is acceptable, what does not make you lift an eyebrow or startle you when you hear it? And we have to consider also that language changes. There is no such thing as a frozen language, a language that stays the same through time and has never changed. So sometimes you hear that Appalachian English is exactly the same as Shakespearean English. No, that's not possible. These people live in the 20th century. They speak 20th century English. Actually, they live in the 21st century and they speak 21st century English. Language changes with each generation. It changes within a generation. And we can all think of all kinds of changes that we've seen in our lifetimes in language in terms of the lexicon and sometimes in terms of the grammar. Generally, The lexicon changes the most rapidly, followed by the sound system, and then by the grammar. So we have to be careful with what is grammatical and not stick to what is written in grammar books, but to think about what we accept as sentences, as perfectly normal, that we understand as native speakers of the language. Okay, now let's get more deeply into prescriptive versus descriptive grammar. These are not grammars that you use to produce sentences, but are ways of talking about the language. Prescriptive grammar is what you find in Strunk and White, for example, and other grammar or language style books. It's what Mrs. Talkwright used to tell you when you were in 3rd grade. Take, for instance, the sentence, "Everyone should eat his lunch." How do you understand that? If I heard it, I would understand it to mean that some poor kid is going to have his lunch eaten by everybody else. However, the sentence cited here demonstrates the notion of the distributive singular and the notion that the masculine is used when gender is unknown. Everyone has one lunch, therefore you say his lunch. Except the language has changed now, and his clearly refers to a singular masculine person. Now we would say everyone should eat their lunch since it is used as a genderless singular. That sounds more normal, doesn't it? But according to prescriptive grammar, that's an ungrammatical sentence. A descriptive grammar, on the other hand, simply describes the language as it's being used. A descriptive grammar would say that everyone should eat their lunch is a common type of sentence, that when we don't know the gender, we use the plural pronoun or the plural possessive adjective. Descriptive grammars do not make any value judgments and do not say that a sentence is bad English or sloppy English or poor English, if a sentence structure is commonly found. Be careful in your class discussions not to use words like sloppy, lazy, beautiful, flowing, musical, etc. Linguists describe the language as we see it without passing any judgment on it. Now let's talk a little bit about language variation. Not everyone speaks exactly the same way. There are differences based on geography. So for instance, people in the Northeast United States don't speak the same as people in the Southeast, who don't speak exactly the same way as people in the West. And then we've got Australians, and we've got people from Britain, who themselves have a lot of variation. Let's define some terms here. Sometimes people use dialect to mean a lesser version of a language. All languages are essentially dialects. The linguist Max Weinreich said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. One way to think about it is that you've got dialects of a language, and they're all pretty much equal, but the name of the language group is the one that is spoken by whatever group it is that has power. If we look at France, for example, there were many dialects spoken on that territory. However, the seat of power was in the Île-de-France, where Francien was spoken. Since that's what the king spoke, that's the name that was given to the language. Linguists now prefer to use the term variety rather than dialect. Let's take an example from botany. If you go to the supermarket now, you can't just go in and ask for an apple. You can go to the produce section and there will be displays of different apples, Fuji's and Jonathan's, Delicious, Braeburn, Granny Smith, etc. But there's no apple that's just called apple. So apple is the language, and the varieties of apple are the dialects. Dialects differ from accents. Accent refers to the phonological system. So a person from the east coast of the U.S. has a different accent from someone from the deep south. However, the lexicon is pretty much the same, and there were no real grammatical differences between the two. That's not the case for American and British English, for example. There are some grammatical and lexical differences between the two varieties, so they can be considered different dialects rather than simply different accents. And again, linguists prefer the term regional variety, or simply variety, to dialect. In our class, we're going to be mostly concerned with the spoken language. Why? Because language is essentially spoken. Writing depends on there being a language to write, while a language does not require a written form. Essentially, writing is a graphic representation of sound. The spoken language predates writing by millennia. Written speech is much more recent than spoken language. Also, there are many languages that do not have a written form. Now, the fact that they don't have a written form doesn't mean that they're lesser languages. It just means that they don't have a written form. And when we speak, when we describe the spoken language, we have to be careful to use appropriate terminology. We'll talk about sounds rather than letters. Not all languages use an alphabetic system, for example, so you really can't talk about Chinese letters, but you can talk about Chinese sounds. Writing is generally considered to be more prestigious, and one reason for that is that you can take your time with it. When you speak, the words come out of your mouth and are out there. Spoken language is more spontaneous. Sentences in spoken language tend to be less complex because you can't keep track of all of the information. People don't speak like Marcel Proust writes, with sentences that go on for a page and a half. Writing, because you could spend more time with it, tends to be more complex because you can always go back and reread. So, because of its complexity, people tend to think that writing is somehow better. It's not better, it's just more polished. Make sure that you keep these concepts in mind when you do the discussions and for all of your other assignments.